Hi everyone, and welcome to today's masterclass with the Social Mobility Commission, which is insights to drive your decisions and interventions through the use of data. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Paula Kemp. I joined the Social Mobility Commission earlier this month, and up until that point I actually was the other side of the fence. So I was an employer working for an employer like you, and wondering about what data we need to collect, how others are doing it. So if that's the questions that you're posing today, you're at the right place. So just a bit about today's agenda. So first of all, I will share with you some work we've been doing in the Social Mobility Commission with others in terms of determining the best question to ask, and then what you might do with that question and the answers you get, and how you might use that to inform your socio-economic background and social mobility strategy. Joining us today, we have Andrew Young from the BBC, and Andrew will share with us insights how the BBC have used data to inform their decisions, and what else they're doing in this space. We're then joined by Cliff Sale, who will go through their similar journey, but whilst same journey, different challenges, and he'll be able to share with you what the Hmrc have done, which has led them to be a Social Mobility Award winner. And then we're joined by Heather Carey of Work Advance. So Heather works with the creative industries, their policy and evidence centre, and one of our partners at Social Mobility Commission, and really looking at how data informs decisions within that industry. So looking forward to hearing from Heather in terms of how that work is going for them. And then there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions of our panelists, of our speakers. And then we close out today, a bit later on today, with Maureen, who will be sharing with you how you can put your applications in to be a social mobility employer index, and have a look at those benchmarks and really benchmark yourself against other organisations that are doing some fantastic work in this space. So just a little bit of housekeeping. If you could remain on mute, that would be great. When it comes to the Q&A, we'll be looking at questions that you've posed in the Q&A function. For those of you who are not familiar with Zoom or hasn't actually used the Q&A function, there's obviously a chat box where you're used to finding things. But if you post something in the Q&A, colleagues of mine, Matt Corbett and Richard Moore, are on hand to answer any questions you've got. But we'll also obviously leave some there if you've got any questions for the particular speakers as we're going through. And also the webinar is being recorded, so you can play that back, but also we'll share the link with you afterwards. So if you've enjoyed it or found it really useful, then we would ask that you then share it with other colleagues who might find it useful. So what is social mobility? Well, it's the link between a person's occupation or income and the occupation or income of their parents. And what we're looking for really is to ensure that where you start in life doesn't determine where you can end up. In terms of ambition, progression, and moving out of where your starting point in life is really. So we've asked you before you joined the session last week, we asked you, and those who responded have told us what you're doing in this space. So what I find really interesting in these statistics is that 90% of you have a D&I strategy, but only half of you have actually set D&I targets, which is interesting. So how do you know that you're achieving what you want to achieve without those targets? And even more interesting is that only 14% of you have set socio-economic background diversity targets. And so our speakers today will talk a bit about what they've done and how they've moved how they've set targets, or when they're going to set targets, or how you might think about doing that. And then also lots of you have said that you have use data to inform your success of attracting lower socioeconomic backgrounds to the organisation, 20% of you, and that how you progress, 20% of you, if you said that you've used that. So we'll be looking at what data we can collect can help us really change the narrative for people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds within an organisation. You also told us that 13% of you feel that your organisation does understand the importance of measuring it, but that means there's a huge 87% that you feel that your organisation doesn't, which is perhaps why you're here today. And that 3/4 of you feel there's a lack of understanding of what question we should ask of current employers, of current employees. So therefore, we know historically it's been quite a difficult question to ask, and so we've simplified that, and we'll be talking about that a bit later on. And actually nearly half of you have said that you find it challenging knowing how to interpret any of the data you've got. So hopefully today's examples from our speakers will help you have a think about how you might do that. So without further ado, what questions, excuse me, I'm just going to take a drink of water. So early last year, we launched an employers toolkit, and what we found through feedback is that only 17% of employers actually asked the question around social mobility, because they found the 4 questions, which actually with the subset led to 7 questions, were just too long to ask. And so therefore, we decided that as a group, as a collective, with partners of ours and with academic partners as well, that we would look at what could we do to change that and make it easier for you. And so we consulted with all these experts and think tanks, etc., and we created just 1 question to measure socioeconomic diversity, and that we feel is the key question, and therefore it can fit very nicely into any surveys you're doing in terms of global engagement surveys, or the question for your HR database. And so that question is, what was the occupation of your household owner when you were about 14? And the responses to those then lead us to 3 main professional groups. So you would have professional groups, intermediate groups, and those in the working class. And the option for using this just helps simplify the opportunity to actually start to dive a bit deeper and ask the question of your employees. There's an option to exclude as well, so people can prefer not to say if they don't think it applies to them. They might also have grown up in care, and therefore you could, in your narrative around the question you're asking, you could say if you grew up in care, you can tick the box other, etc. But it gives you a nice framework to actually have a look at the employees within your organisation based on these 3 sections. If you want to up your game, we would say don't lose sight of the other questions that were traditionally asked. It can really help influence and dig deeper into the data that you're getting. So as you can see on the screen there are those questions about types of school, were you eligible for free school meals, and if your parents were graduates. And the reason none of these became the main question is that occupational question really helps support if you have people who didn't grow up or weren't educated, or at the age of 14 just weren't living in the UK. So it really helps translate across all internationalities really within your organisation. If you were to ask type of school, it certainly does help us measure extreme economic advantage, because just 7% of people attend independent schools. But what we found is then that makes up much more than 7% of the senior population within employers. And then in terms of the free school meals as well, it shows a real disadvantage, an extreme economic disadvantage. And that can really help you target outreach areas. So in terms of working with partners to reach certain schools, if they have a high proportion of free school meal attendees, that will show you that could really help drive your outreach if that's how you want to reach a more widening pool of people to understand a bit more about your industry or your business. And then we would also say still include for graduates the question around parental, whether their parents had been graduates, because it helps signify the changing the workforce and would really help you understand your employee database a lot better. So if you've got the question and you are wanting to improve your response rates, so you set it all up and you want to improve your response rates, then there are many ways that you can think about increasing your response rates. We suggest that having about 70% response rate is really powerful. And I know there's organisations there who think they've got there in the 80s and think they still want to go higher. But if you're starting from a very low base, that's obviously your extreme where you want to reach. But in terms of improving them, and get senior leaders within your organisation to really be the ones that are vocal on this and really clearly explain to your employees why you're doing it. Interestingly enough, when you think about apprenticeships and graduates, actually graduates and apprenticeships are so used to answering questions like this from college or university that it doesn't faze them, and it might be your older workforce or experienced hires that have not seen this before because they're more used to other diversity questions. And so therefore there's a real sort of communication piece around why you're doing it, and open and transparent conversations with your employees as to that it's to build an inclusive environment within your organisation and to make sure that you are widening the opportunity for people throughout the communities that you serve and the customers you serve, and how it will drive positive inclusive action for your organisation. In particular, using senior role models to share their own stories of their socio-economic background can help people really feel like they can open up themselves. So that's another great way of kind of encouraging and building that this is why we're collecting this data. And, be very open and transparent in terms of what the data is being used for. The fact it's usually only a handful of people within the HR team that will see that, and it's anonymized data. It will never come back to that particular person, but it just gives you a really good indication of how you're operating in and how if you have got targets, how you're meeting targets, or if you haven't yet got targets, how you want to understand the starting point so that you can get to targets to really build that inclusive nature within your organization. So once you've got the data, we recommend that you collect, analyse, publish, and you can report against the 3 different backgrounds in terms of professional background, intermediate or working class. And you can just have a really clear picture on what does your organisation and the workforce look like. And once you get that starting point, we would suggest you then map it against your industry benchmarks or national benchmarks as well, and just to see what your workforce looks like. And then you can dive a bit deeper and see, is it representative of the nation? And so what sort of strategies or what sort of interventions might you need to change that? Or use our toolkits, which we'll share with you links afterwards, toolkits in terms of how you might change that within your organisation. And if you want to lead best practice, then start to think about how you can encourage other people that you know and influence others to actually start measuring socioeconomic background data as well. So here are the national benchmarks. We're actually doing some analysis on this that we couldn't do because of COVID actually. And so if there are any updates to this, we will be sharing that with you in a few months' time. But you'll see there's 42% working class people. So if that's what your workforce currently looks like when you collect your data, then you know that your workforce repeats what it's like in the national area or whatever. Types of schools. So we know from our State of the Nation report that an Elite Britain report that 7.5% of people attended independent schools, yet we also know in certain industries, the senior leaders within that industry, there are many more than that national average, and that around 15% of pupils at state-funded schools are eligible for free school meals. And so that's where you can then have a real understanding of where you're hitting those national benchmarks or how you differ against those benchmarks. So it's important not to just focus on the getting in when you're thinking about bringing people into the organisation. And if you're putting in interventions like apprenticeships that reach pupils from a lower socioeconomic background, or outreach programs that then lead into traineeships, etc., it's important to think about how they actually then get on once they're within that organisation. So definitely collect the key question and cut it down into the levels within your organisation and see where there's differences. Analyse how you can think about where those changes might need, where increases might need to, or where targets need to be set to really understand the level of seniority within your organisation. And have a think about how you might understand what barriers there might be for that are limiting those that are getting into the organisation from moving forward. And you can also consider speed of progression. So for instance, in my previous role, I was engaged with some industry research where they were looking at progression within the organisation, and what they found were within the industry, and what they found were on average, it took people from a lower socioeconomic background 25% longer to progress within the organisation. And the piece of work now that needs to be done is to understand why that is. But without having collected the data before, there was no knowledge of that was actually happening. There's no way to address it. And then look at the opportunities that you might have for apprenticeships and training. So what we found in our State of the Nation report in 2019 is that people from a lower socioeconomic background, 49% of those adults had not received any form of training or education since leaving school. And so therefore, what does the picture look like for the training opportunities for the people within your organisation? Is the take up lower depending on your socioeconomic background? Is the opportunity just not there for them to do it? Or do people from a lower socioeconomic background feel that that's not for them? And how might you change the narrative on that, and have a think about how you can use the data that you're getting to benchmark and to understand against all the other pieces of along the employee life cycle. So from entry right the way through to the reward that they get, as well as retaining them in the industry and progressing. So for those of you that who've already told us that you're already collecting the data, then there's an opportunity, and you can go to our website afterwards, and we'll send you the link for those who are mature in this, to actually track progress and understand where they are on this situation. So we worked with our partners at the Social Mobility Foundation through their employer index, and found that you know, the target is to aim for at least 70% responses, but actually for those organisations that feature highly in the Social Mobility Employer Index, you know, there's actually, they get 86% completion rates for all of their diversity data. And then in terms of which questions to ask as well, you know, that some of them ask those deeper questions. So you're benchmarking against those organisations that feature highly. 49% of them also on their new hires collect data on free school meals, so to really understand that economic disadvantage. And so this scorecard would help you in terms of understanding how you can benchmark against peers who are performing really well in this area, and in terms of where your data sets should be, really. So, right, so that's enough of that. So I'm delighted to introduce Andrew Young. He's the diversity lead of the BBC, and he's going to talk us through the BBC, what data they collect and how they've gone about it, and their data journey. So Andrew, over to you.
Thanks very much, Paula. Hello, everyone, and thanks for that introduction. And I think it's really interesting to kind of see that kind of poll that you did at the beginning. And, you know, even sort of, you know, I'm here is sort of saying that we're sort of reasonably advanced in this journey, but some of those things that I think everyone's kind of grappling with, we still are, which is kind of things like setting a target around socioeconomic diversity. And even though we're kind of a little bit in our journey with this, I think we've all got kind of quite a long way to go with it. We started our kind of socioeconomic diversity journey back in 2016, and it was sort of at a time we just published our diversity strategy at that time, and there was no mention of socioeconomic diversity in that strategy, but we quickly kind of saw that it was an area that as employers we needed to look at, but crucially, obviously, as we all know, the BBC's funded by everybody. It is there to serve the audiences across the nations, regardless of their background. And so we needed to do more in order to make sure that our workforce kind of reflected the nation and the audiences that we were serving. So the kind of the first stage of that was looking at the diversity of our kind of makeup as it is at the moment. So we launched a staff census back in 2016 to try and, I guess, separate some of that fact from fiction, because the BBC, as you would imagine, has got this kind of perception as being quite kind of posh and middle class and exclusionary and a bit sort of public schooly, and we didn't have any data to sort of say whether it was or it wasn't. So we partnered with the Bridge Group. They helped us develop our questions. They were working with the civil service at the time, who I think were quite sort of pioneering in this kind of area a few years ago. And based on the kind of the work that they'd done and their advice, we chose 3 questions, which was the parental occupation question, whether your parents had a degree or not, so the highest level of education that your parents had, and also the type of school that you went to. And as I say, those were part of a kind of a wider diversity census, obviously looking at all the other characteristics as well. So that really gave us a picture of diversity for our staff, and we've been publishing that in our annual report for a few years now. You can go onto our website if you really want to have a look at it. It's a nice kind of weighty tome, a kind of lots of data tables at the back of the annual report there, so you can kind of delve in and see, you know, what the diversity is like across different divisions of the BBC, and our kind of leaver joiner data and stuff like that. So that's all kind of quite transparent. And as I say, we've been publishing socioeconomic diversity data in there for about 4 years now. But because only around 60% of the organisation responded to that initial census, we unfortunately don't have the powers like ONS do to legally mandate it for people. So it is on that kind of goodwill basis, and like with all surveys, you don't get a full response rate. So we only had data for just under 60% of our workforce, and as I'll say, that was kind of some of the problems that we've kind of encountered over the time, really. But what we also wanted to do was to look at beyond the data, or kind of, well, I guess, what's behind the data. So in 2018, as part of a suite of culture and career progression reviews, we consulted with staff about socioeconomic diversity to sort of better understand what was working well, perhaps wasn't working so well, and to try and create the best possible environment for people to progress their careers at the BBC, and obviously be themselves at the BBC as well. And one of the recommendations from that consultation with staff was to look at the data in more detail, try and look at the career progression rates of different staff from different backgrounds, and also to sort of look at people's individual experiences. So depending on your socioeconomic background, have you had, you know, an easier time, or has it been a little bit more challenging within the organisation? So again, we worked with the Bridge Group. They carried out some very in-depth data analysis to look at career progression rates. And what that showed us was that it can take longer to progress your career if you are from a lower socioeconomic background at the BBC. And I think that's kind of quite difficult to see when it's kind of like black and white on the page. And I think it's something that, you know, we were sort of aware of, but when you kind of see the data like that, it's kind of difficult. But the new Director General, Tim Davey, has kind of very much acknowledged the fact that we need to kind of move away from this sense of a BBC type, and certainly individual leaders need to stop hiring in their own image. And I think that sort of is something where the data will start to move once we've sort of addressed some of those things. Another recommendation of that review with staff was to set up a staff network for socioeconomic diversity. We've obviously got lots of other lots of other diversity networks, such as disability, ethnicity, and sexual orientation. But we didn't have a socioeconomic diversity network, and so we established that. That was back in November 2019, and we've already got 700 members across the organisation who are part of that. But as I mentioned at the beginning, we only had about sort of 60% of the organisation who had disclosed their socioeconomic diversity to us. So that made it quite difficult for us to think about setting a target. We have targets for ethnicity, we have targets for disability, we have targets for gender, because we've got quite good data for those different metrics. But for socioeconomic diversity, when you only know 60% of the organisation, you're missing kind of 40% of the organisation. So last month we launched a new census that was again sent out to all staff across all the diversity characteristics. And this time we did actually swap the questions about a bit. So we took out the parental education question because I think, as you know, as Paula was saying, it's not necessarily something that is a great metric. Of course, the main one is of the parental occupation, and if we did set a target, that's what it would be on. But we've swapped in the free school meals question because I think there is a kind of a real benefit of having that question. We've got quite an international workforce, so it's not totally appropriate for everybody, but it did feel like it was a better fit than the parental education one. So that census closed a week or so ago. Don't have the results of that yet, but I think what that will mean is that hopefully we're in a better position to say, this is what the baseline is, this is what we've got within the organisation now, and then to look at what a target might be. And I think just a point on the censuses, the way that we run them, is that because the data sits on our HR record, obviously in a very secure area that people don't have access to apart from just a small team that run the data reports, that data is kind of kept quite live. So as people join the organisation, they're asked these questions on their new joiner form. As they leave the organisation, they sort of come off that data. And also as people maybe move around the organisation. So if I got a promotion or I moved to a different division, that data would sort of come with me. So in real time, it's kind of always quite sort of up to date, and means that it doesn't sort of have that sort of snapshot basis like something like the ONS data does. And we've also just published our diversity and inclusion plan, which sets out the organisation's approach to D&I over the next 3 years. And as I said, the strategy that we had, which came to an end at the end of 2020, was without socio-economic diversity. Now, obviously, socio-economic diversity is very much part of that diversity and inclusion plan, looking at lots of things around talent attraction, a complete overhaul of our recruitment process, leadership development pipelines, and various things like that. And the thread that's kind of going throughout that plan is what we're calling the gold standard to inclusion. And I think when we kind of look beyond the data of just sort of how many people we've got in the organization and where they sit and how quickly they progress, and some of the stuff that came through from the Bridge Group's in-depth interviews that they did with people was this kind of notion of bringing your whole self to work, that authentic self. Some of the stuff that we've talked about for a number of years around being out at work in terms of sexual orientation, I think is very similar in terms of other non-visible characteristics like socioeconomic diversity, when bringing your whole self to work really is something that you have to sort of make yourself do, and then can mean that you're bringing a lot more diversity of thought to the organization, and hopefully, obviously, starts to reflect in our case the content that is our business, and makes that a lot more diverse. So that was a quick whistle-stop tour. Take a breath now, and I will stop talking there. But I will hand over to Cliff Sale from Hmrc to talk about the work that they've been doing in this area.
Thank you, Andrew. Thanks for that, and hello everybody. So in Hmrc, we've been collecting various forms of data around socioeconomic background for a number of years now, and hopefully the diagram on the next slide shows a representation how we've used this to drive social mobility activity and our strategy. So if you could just have the next slide, please. But of course, in reality, this is far too simple a representation. That's because by definition, data, of course, is not just about the facts and figures, but also the observations, descriptions, and feedback. So we're continually receiving data in many different guises through conversations, feedback, stories, emails, reports, and events like this, all of which continue to influence our approach and our ambitions. So in reality, the diagram, of course, would look a lot more busy than it does at the moment. But what it does do is provide an ability to pick out a few key approaches that we've taken over the years. So similar to how Andrew just described it then, at the very start of things, we began small with an initial dedicated survey to a sample of staff using questions previously piloted in the Cabinet Office survey for senior civil servants. And the survey got us about a 42% response rate, which at the time we were really happy with, because the understanding around social mobility was still quite low and the questions were unfamiliar to people. So we built on this. We began to incorporate social economic background questions into more regular but general surveys that are routinely sent out to Hmrc people to test the temperature. And from this, we began to get that initial baseline to work from. We also identified specific areas to conduct qualitative research, to explore and understand staff attitudes, opinions and experiences of enablers and barriers that people faced before joining Hmrc once they'd got in, and also gathering their views on how they saw their future development and career prospects. We also gathered feedback from presentations or staff network, internal Yammer conversations and other channels. And also participants were asked to give their interpretation of what social mobility meant to them, which helped us gauge awareness and better target our communications. So all this then allowed us to start influencing existing activity, but more importantly, it also helped us make the case for some new initiatives, such as the introduction of a new dedicated mentoring scheme. So using the evidence we'd gathered and with a little help from our friends in the Ministry of Justice, we introduced our Stride mentoring scheme at the end of 2019. And since then, Stride has grown into an award-winning mentoring and self-development scheme, which has so far helped over 700 staff from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. And its ongoing success is down in no small part to the way that we've been keen to capture the data and feedback from participants, which continually shapes and improves the offer, identify new ways to partner and support our mentees' development. And since 2017, Hmrc has also participated in the annual Employer Index. We've been constantly ranked as one of the UK's top 50 employers. Taking part in this has not only given us the currency that recognition brings, which we've used alongside other achievements to influence further change in and outside Hmrc, but continues to challenge us in the kinds of corporate information that we capture, how effective it is for us, and also how we go about using it then. And every year, the civil service also conducts a voluntary people survey across every department, with roughly 2/3 of staff taking part in that. For the last 2 years, it's carried socioeconomic background questions. And like many other departments, this has been our first opportunity to benchmark on a large scale and also draw comparisons with other big departments and the civil service generally. It showed us that Hmrc has more people who self-identify as coming from a lower socioeconomic background than virtually any other government department, which, to be honest, was a bit of a surprise to us and immediately made us wonder whether it was time to pack up because job done. But of course, that's rather a blunt self-identification question, and it needs to be taken in context with more objective responses that we've spoken about earlier in today's presentation. And in many areas, the results actually have confirmed wider ranging issues, such as the common disparities that most organisations face as roles become more senior. But once again, it's challenged us around some of the assumptions that we've made, and we want to understand more about what that does, and that's the whole purpose of good data, is it challenges you, makes you want to look further. Most importantly, it's involved the vast majority of our people, so it's increased awareness and interest around social mobility, and people's interest to be part of that change. As a result, we've seen big increases in our staff network, which has trebled in size over the last year. And finally, and rather belatedly this month, we've also introduced new IT functionality for staff to record the SEB data on our HR systems. We're now working hard to get that completion rate up so we can make full use of that and hopefully conduct a disparity audit once we have all the representative data in there. So it's also helped us set our social mobility strategy and the strands of work that you can see at the bottom of the diagram, such as Stride, and also the Life Chances programs our outreach team have developed, which not only provide work experience for many disadvantaged groups, but also using the data and the feedback that we've been able to get from that, make cases for exceptions programs, which now allow us to create opportunities to offer proper and permanent jobs at the end of it. The most recent of which is our Springboard program, designed specifically for kids excluded from mainstream education, who can now get work experience with us and the possibility of a permanent job at the end of it. But I often think that data is a little bit like cupboard space or money. It's something that you feel that you always need more of, but then when you get it, you wonder whether you're actually making effective use of it. So we feel that we're probably at a good point now in terms of our journey to take stock of the data that we've already got. We'll be looking over the coming months at how best we can segment it further, test our current understanding and assumptions, and plan our next steps. So if we could just have the next slide, please. So one of the things we was asked to do today was considering our journey and our experience, was perhaps look at some of the helpful tips to overcome barriers to data collection. So we've narrowed that down to 4 main headings, which I'll just quickly go through. So first of all, recognise that colleagues might not feel safe or comfortable. So, you know, one of the things that our data showed when we started looking at it was that colleagues in the lower grades, the administrative grades, were actually 3 times more likely to choose the prefer not to say answer to SEB questions than the higher paid grades. So obviously that indicates that you know, there's an element of discomfort there in terms of whether it's safe to disclose it, whether it's safe to talk about it. So it's about creating a safe environment first of all. Using a variety of different role models that's relatable. We've talked earlier on today about how we can use senior role models to showcase opportunity within organisations, but it's also worthwhile remembering that people want to see examples from all levels. It's all very well showing the ultimate opportunity within an organisation, but sometimes people also need to see that, you know, in the immediacy, that they're able to progress as well into those roles. So having a wide representation of role models is important. Get a slot on the agenda and spread the word. So breaking down barriers around background is about conversations. Really exploit any chance to get the subject on the agenda. And data is a great way to do that. You can unlock lots of opportunities by using data from stuff you've gathered around social mobility to basically hijack many different agenda items and get that conversation going. So use data to unlock that opportunity. Get allies to help overcome misconceptions. You know, regardless of the size of the organization, you can't possibly do this on your own. Having allies at all grades will help ensure that any challenges and possible negativity are addressed quickly and accurately. So make sure that they have all the facts. You know, it's quite easy for one person to start derailing a really good data collection campaign if it's left unchecked. So as I say, make sure you've got lots of allies out there who are willing to help and who have the facts and figures to help you do that. Explain the what and the why, and start small and grow, which is something we spoke about earlier. Be careful about big bang approaches to collecting data. Far better to test and learn and starting small and scaling up than having to roll back on big initiatives and risking that long-term disengagement, which then needs to be recovered later on. So provide content and transparency and strategic implications. Andrew just mentioned there about the sort of the golden thread, showing how gathering this data links to other things and why it's important. So don't communicate in a vacuum, provide the bigger picture and explain what the longer term prospects are. Highlight significant ways in which data has helped. So provide examples, proper examples of how data has been used to drive initiatives and improvements that people can recognize and relate to. You told us this and we introduced Stride as a result is a really good and powerful tool that we use. Be consistent and ensure data compatibility and gain trust. So try to be consistent in what you're asking and how you interpret the data. We spoke there about the types of questions you can ask. You know, try and choose the questions that you're going to use and use them appropriately. Understand what the data is needed for and why, and when to use other sources as well. You know, quite often we can get carried away with the number of questions we ask people. We might need that information, but actually, do we need to ask the people the information, or do we have it elsewhere? Can we build trust by using information that we've already held for them in a secure way and not asking them time and time again? So demonstrate this involves everybody. You know, emphasize diversity and all backgrounds, and I think this is really important. Socio-economic diversity, by definition, means people of all backgrounds, and people of all backgrounds need to engage with it. So targeting only those from low socio-economic backgrounds won't help you and won't give you the complete picture you need. And part of that is around helping understand and not demonizing privilege. So privilege is something that most people don't recognize as having. It's therefore crucial to talk about the different forms of privilege and raise awareness of how that helps without making people feel excluded or guilty, but involving them in the process. And good data collection needs, of course, everybody to do that. And finally, don't just target the obvious groups. You know, don't be tempted to target certain business areas, departments, or grades to get the evidence you need. Again, go for the true picture. and use people to drive the change. Use ambassadors and allies at every level. We mentioned before, having a good cross-representation at all levels means that the explanation of the what and the why and the responses to challenge can be met and accurately. Don't just rely on senior managers to drive change. It's really going to lose impact that way. You need to have change driven at every level of the organization. Finally, one of my favorites here, find ways to sneak the message into the everyday. Get creative. So persuade people to change the profile picture or include logos on signature buttons, to spread the word into everyday meetings and correspondence. I mentioned before that we've just introduced the HR recording of SEB data. We're persuading people at the moment to try and change their profile picture to something that says I've completed my SEB data. We're asking them to put it into their email signatures, and it's a really easy and powerful tool. When you join a Teams call and you see several people pop up all with the same message, all saying that they've completed the data, as I say, it can be a really powerful and very straightforward tool. Set challenging but realistic targets. You know, if you're lucky enough to have unlimited time and resource, and you can be as ambitious as you want to be, but for most of us, there's a limit. So agree up front what you think would be challenging but achievable. Again, avoid future disengagement by being too ambitious about the results. Measure and evaluate that then, and the achievements. Overcoming the barriers to data collection is one thing, but then you need to be open about what it's told you and how well it's going. So, you know, celebrate the milestones along the way. If it's a long project, encourage further participation with a sense of involvement, and, you know, get past that initial piece. So finally, after saying all that, I'd just like to stress that we're still very much trying to put all that into practice. So I suppose that the final tip as well is remember not to beat yourself up either. So that's me come to an end. So thanks for that, and I'll pass you over now to Heather.
Thanks, Cliff. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm really happy to join you here for this panel discussion on MS Data Masterclass. I'm here talking about some work that we're leading at the Creative Industries Policy and Evidence Centre, which is part of the government's industrial strategy and sector deal for the creative industries, and is an organisation that tries to use research and data and insight to help the creative industries to respond to the kind of challenges of today and tomorrow, essentially to secure the future success of the sector. And one of those really big challenges sits with diversity and inclusion. So I want to tell you a bit about our programme that seeks to use data and research to catalyse industry leadership on social mobility. So we've heard a lot this afternoon about why data is important for individual businesses as they seek to better support social mobility within their organisations. But I think a question for us is always, you know, why is data important at the industry level? And I think the short answer to that is that for all the reasons we've just heard, all the reasons it's important for individual businesses. So, you know, at an industry level, data enables us to establish a baseline, to better understand the problem we're working with, to inform action, to assess impact, and to track progress. So lots of similar reasons to those that we've heard today. But most importantly, at the industry level, unlike anecdotal evidence and subjective insights, hard data enables us to establish a common understanding, a shared ownership of the problem or the challenge, or indeed, depending on what you're looking at, the opportunity, and to garner collective action in response to this. And that's really important at the industry level, because I think if we're all working off different inconsistent evidence, we're likely to understand the issues differently, and that's going to lead us to act differently. And if we're all pulling in different directions, we're not going to be able to maximise our collective impact. At the same time, I think there's a real case for not reinventing the wheel. You know, many businesses, particularly when they operate in similar markets or sectors or parts of the country, actually share quite common problems. So equally, there's scope to work kind of collaboratively to solve those problems. And then finally, the other point I'd argue is that individual employee leadership is absolutely vital. It's something I've advocated for the best part of 2 decades. But undoubtedly, there are equally limits to what can be achieved when acting alone. And this is particularly true in a sector like the creative industries, which is dominated by micro businesses, where businesses themselves rely on freelance workers, which kind of creates this mobility of the workforce across the sector, across organisations. And we also know that the underlying causes of class imbalances are actually influenced by factors that affect people before they enter the workforce. So some of those really early life or educational issues, for example. So there's a really compelling case, I think, for data at the industry level and to enable us to kind of maximise our collective impact. And this is the premise of the programme we're leading on class and social mobility in the creative industries. So if we can move to the next slide, thank you, super slick. So the overarching aim of this programme is ambitious. You know, we are absolutely seeking to catalyse collaborative action by industry and government and stakeholders to enhance socio-economic diversity in the creative industries. So really, really ambitious. But we start, and our first phase of our work started with using data to establish a baseline picture of participation and progression of those from working class backgrounds in the creative industries at the industry level. And we did so without getting into too much detail about the data sources. We used the kind of gold standard government workforce survey called the Labour Force Survey, and that underpins the Office for National Statistics' regular labour market statistics. We also worked with a survey called Understanding Society, which is a really long-running longitudinal social survey. Used to be called something big different, but it's been running for decades. And that allows us to look at additional measures to do with things like job quality, or because it's longitudinal, we can look at things like retention and progression. And in doing so, we sought to use the same sorts of measures that we've just heard about today and that Paula provided really compelling and thorough introduction to earlier, particularly using the question around parental occupation at age 14. So this was phase one, and actually this analysis told us some really useful things. So moving on to the next slide. What it did was it reinforced what we felt we already knew and could see, which is that there are widespread and persistent class imbalances in the creative industries. So some of these circles on the kind of bottom left-hand corner of the slide emphasise some of this point. And I would emphasise that these measures, while broadly in line with the SMC metrics, the paper was done in August, so they don't capture the most recent changes. But what you can see is that the majority, so 52% of those working in creative occupations in 2019, so this is pre-COVID, were from privileged backgrounds. And that compared to a measure across the whole of the workforce of about 37%. And the flip side of that, of course, is that just 16% of those working in key creative roles in the creative industries were from working class backgrounds, compared to 21% of those across all professional occupations in the economy and 29% across all occupations. So at a really kind of headline level, what that said to us is that social mobility is actually a bigger issue for the creative industries than it is actually for other professional occupations and for the economy as a whole. It's a really important starting point. What you can see on the right-hand side of the slide is the data can tell us more. And what it started to tell us was that class imbalances exist in every creative industry, with the exception of craft. There are 9 we use. They range from advertising to architecture to performing arts to film. And those class imbalances are widespread in every one of those 9 subsectors, with the exception of class. Relatedly and quite concerningly, what we also found was that those from privileged backgrounds tend to dominate the most creative roles in the industry. So they determine what goes on page and what goes on stage and what goes on screen. And the analysis on the right-hand side really helped us understand the occupations in which the issue, class imbalances, were particularly pronounced. Moving on to the next slide, we sought to kind of understand the role of class in influencing outcomes. And I think what it told us is that we know class isn't the only factor at play here, and the data, we can look at wider inequalities and exclusions associated with somebody's gender or ethnicity, whether they have a disability or long-term health condition, and their skill levels. And quite interestingly, actually, it told us that only a person's qualifications has a greater impact on the likelihood of landing in a creative occupation than someone's class origin. So we know class is really important in that broader discussion about diversity and inclusion. Not presented on the slide, but further analysis in our paper, which I'm happy to circulate after this event, we equally sought to understand how class interacts with other factors like gender and ethnicity and disability and skills. And what we found are there are clear, as you might expect, intersections that create double disadvantage. And that really highlights how important that issue of intersectionality is. Additionally, you can see at the bottom of the slide some interesting metrics here that really sought to tell us what we've heard from individual organisations, but at an industry level, it's not just about getting in. It's actually about getting on once in employment in creative occupations. So some of our measures looked at job quality, and we found that those from working class backgrounds tended to experience less autonomy in their work and less control over their work. We found there were differences, quite significant, I think 12 percentage point differences in the extent to which between the classes in terms of whether they had supervisory responsibility or whether they progressed into managerial roles. And this tells us that even when successful in landing in a creative role, not in itself an easy task from all the statistics we've seen, those from a working class background face further obstacles to progressing in the sector. Now, finally, and possibly most concerningly, the data told us that despite growing awareness, just skipping to the next slide, please, despite growing awareness of this issue and action actually by businesses and government and industry stakeholders to promote greater inclusion, we're not making progress on this issue at the creative industries level. So what you can see from this chart is that while overall the chances of people landing in a creative occupation have increased, you can see all these lines going up, right? Irrespective of class origin. And that's because the creative industries have been growing and growing really rapidly relative to the rest of the economy. But what's interesting actually is the differential between the outcomes of those from privilege and working class backgrounds. So this is the gap essentially between the pink line at the top and the purple line at the bottom. And what you can see is that the likelihood of someone from a working class background finding work in a creative occupation has remained largely unchanged since 2014. And we use 2014 because that's the first time in which we could get robust data from the labour force survey on this. I'd hazard a guess if we had data going back 2 decades, we haven't seen great progress then either. So really what the data has achieved for us and for industry is it's created that burning platform for change. That critical, compelling case for collaborative action on social mobility. So kind of moving on to the final slide, it told us as an industry, we have a problem that we need to understand better. And that's what we're doing in phase 2 of our work right now. The data told us where to look actually, and actually as we seek to understand that problem. So we're focusing in on some of those key creative roles I mentioned where class imbalances are most pronounced in screen, looking particularly at roles in the screen industries, in publishing, in advertising and in fashion. The data has also really challenged us to think holistically about this problem, looking beyond participation to really think deeply about the underlying causes of class imbalances. And equally how you kind of overlay that broader narrative about the factors that influence social mobility with the industry context in the creative sector and the distinct kind of characteristics and operations and enterprises, commercial models that kind of operate in the creative industries. And so we're now mapping those underlying causes of class imbalances in the creative industries across different life stages. And that's right from early life factors, so your experiences in childhood, through post-16 education, looking at transition to work, and equally looking at the factors that influence retention and progression when in employment, when in work. And we're equally looking, importantly, to consider those intersections of class with other characteristics like gender and race. And then finally, it's challenged us to come together as an industry actually to explore what we're doing now and to think about how we can enhance the current approach, to consider where we can expand things we're doing, elevate good practice to a higher level or to scale up, or indeed to enhance existing activities to better address in a more holistic way those underlying causes of class imbalances. And this forms our backbone for our programme on social mobility in the creative industries with our partners. So we're working with the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, DCMS, we're working with the Social Mobility Commission, and we're also working on a deep dive in the screen industries with Screen Skills. So importantly, this is about collaborative action, industry coming together to shift the dial on socio-economic diversity in the creative industries in a significant and sustained way. So I'll pause there and I'll hand back to Paula to welcome Q&A for all of the panelists, and I'm happy to answer further questions about anything I've presented here today. Thank you.
Brilliant, thanks Heather. Really insightful actually, as how data can be used across an industry and really influence change and drive change. So we've had many questions come in. So what I'm going to do is direct them to a few of our panelists, but if any one of you has a burning desire to answer it, just show your hand as well. I think one of the questions, there's a few questions that come up the same thing, is the perception of others. So people who don't want to complete their data, it's about completing data, don't want to complete their data because they're worried about what the perception, what's the data going to be used of? What is the perceptions of others if I declare that I had free school meals, if that's the question they're answering, or, you know, the main occupational occupation of the key household person was long-term unemployed when I was age 14 or whatever. And how do you use people within your organisation and utilise people within your organisation to help people understand what that data is going to be used for and why it's necessary, really. So I think I'll come to you first, Andrew, if that's okay. You're on mute.
There you go. Fails. Has to be once at least in every webinar.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two things, isn't there? We are always really clear with staff that socio-economic diversity, like disability, sexual orientation, other aspects, is provided in a confidential way. It's not provided anonymously, but it's certainly provided confidentially. And as I said in my piece, there's only a kind of a small group of people that run those data reports. But I think kind of disclosing something confidentially and also then talking about yourself is sort of a different thing. And so whilst we encourage people to provide their data confidentially, and the fact that no one's going to see it on an individual basis, it's only going to be reported in a way that doesn't identify individuals, we also encourage people to talk about their experiences, be themselves at work, remove any stigmas that might be attached to this or any other characteristics, so that then it isn't so much of a kind of hesitancy to provide the data, because people are very comfortable with it. We see much higher disclosure rates around ethnicity, for example, because for quite a lot of people it's quite visible, and so people are kind of less hesitant to do that. So I think if people are sort of more talking about their experiences and talking about the fact that, yeah, I have free school meals and that's not a big deal, then I think that then encourages people to disclose it on a kind of monitoring form as well.
Brilliant. Thanks, Andrew. Someone actually asked a question of how do you get buy-in from people who don't identify as being from a lower socioeconomic background for this, because many kind of feel attacked for their privilege or worry about levelling up type things. So I wonder actually if Cliff might have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really good point. And just very briefly on the previous matter, I think one of the things I'd add to that is when you're looking at gathering the data, I think one of the things you have to accept is there will always be some people who will not give the information. So no matter how good the argument is, there'll be fundamental reasons why they don't want to do that, and that they should be in the minority. After that, you've got the concerned, which you can deal with, and the willing, who can help you change those concerns. But I think in terms of the question around sort of privilege and how you engage, it is a really key point, because one of the things we're doing here is looking at having diverse workforces, and to have a diverse workforce, you need people from all backgrounds, and quite often it's very tempting to just keep focusing on lower socioeconomic background, and there's an element of that which excludes other people. We mentioned about there's a chance that people can demonize privilege. I think it's mainly around raising that awareness. The thing with privilege, when you talk about any type of privilege, is people tend to be quite defensive about that, or perhaps don't even realize that they have privilege, because of course that's one of the key things around privilege. Why would you be thinking about it? So I think, you know, talking about what that looks like, getting people to raise awareness around you know, the type of privilege that they have, having the conversations around that, you know, using examples within the organization, you know, get senior leaders out there who of course have come from low socioeconomic background, can talk about the movement through the organization, but also balance that off. And, you know, I think in the comments, you know, somebody's put about, do you use leaders who've had more privileged backgrounds? Well, of course, that's great. And if you can get leaders who can actually talk about that and actually acknowledge the type of privilege that they've had, and then say how they are aware of that and how they can help change that within the organization, that's equally as powerful.
Brilliant. Thanks, Cliff. I'm going to ask you, Heather, there's a specific data question. So Amber asks, would it be good to hear thoughts on how we can measure retention and progression from those from a lower SEB background to identify any barriers? In her organisation, they've done some qualitative focus groups and informal feedback, like the Hmrc talked about as well. But how can they collect the quantitative data in that area?
Yeah, sure. So I'll answer from an industry perspective. I'm sure you know, BBC and Hmrc have some good examples from their own organisations around this. I mean, we've tried to get at it by using longitudinal data, so that tracks individuals, and that's because what we want to see is the extent to which whether you progress in your role, and equally whether you remain in the creative industries, creative occupations, is influenced by your class background. So Understanding Society is a social survey, and it essentially works with the same groups of individuals over multiple waves. It's undertaken over several years. And what we sought to do is look at attrition rates for those who were working in creative occupations and understand how that varied depending on if you were from a working class origin or from a privileged background. And we saw very slight differences. And I think what this does is actually highlight the challenge of undertaking this analysis at an industry level. Because when you're working with some of these data sets, by this point, we've cut the data down to the creative industries, and that's equivalent to about 6%, 7% of the overall labour force in the UK. And then we cut that down by class origin. So what we end up working with is with quite small numbers, which is quite why when you come, we're now in phase 2, we're starting to understand how we can, you know, enhance our understanding of that problem. And we are increasingly looking at businesses in terms of making sure businesses across the creative industries are capturing this. And when you capture background, you're kind of starting to look at and being able to break that data down by roles and seniority. There's also a place, I feel, beyond data actually, and looking at progression pathways. And this is quite tricky because, you know, even within the creative industries, the progression pathway for someone that works in the film industry, you know, in camera or film or the lighting department, looks very, very different actually from if you're in architecture or advertising. So this is why for me, you need this blend of information. You need the macro industry picture, which you can break down to a certain degree, can create that burning platform for industry leadership, but that's really got to be complemented by kind of bottom up information led from businesses. As well as kind of bespoke research to understand the nuances within specific progression pathways or parts of the economy.
Brilliant, thank you. In terms of some of the other questions that come around is back to that, why that question, why the occupational question, really. And I guess, you know, we've done some work with academics and industry to think about it. But I guess if people are already sort of set on the free school meals, you know, Heather, do you have any thoughts on kind of why the main occupation is the key one to ask?
So from our perspective, it's about understanding distribution and kind of being further away from some of those more binary metrics. I think people's backgrounds are so nuanced and complex, and actually even parental occupation, when you start to hear those stories. So through phase 2, we're undertaking interviews with people with lived experience of working in key creative roles that have come from a less advantaged background. And what's quite interesting is actually the complexity and how you capture that from a quantitative perspective. You know, we tend to favour parental occupation. There's quite good evidence led initially by the Cabinet Office, and I think they considered something like, and you know, our colleagues at Hmrc probably are closer to this data than I think they considered something like 26 questions, which they subsequently scored on a variety of different factors, and including, you know, how well understood those questions were. But for me, you know, there's a real benefit to using parental occupation. It lines up with some of those official data sources like the Labour Force Survey. And then without getting into too much detail, the National Socio-Economic Classification System, even at a broad level, falls into 9 different categories. So even then you're starting to get a sense for kind of different gradation of data rather than simply a binary, you know, you were on free school meals or not. So it's that nuance, I think, that makes the parental occupation question really valuable, in addition to the consistency between business data and the industry data available from official surveys.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think also from, you know, from our perspective, if you go to a independent or fee paying school, you don't pay for your dinner lunch because it's already paid for as part of the, so there's some nuances there, or there's nuances with people who, you know, if 20% of your workforce grew up abroad, then asking the question about the main householder's occupation is really key, compared to if they answer free school meals, don't know, I don't know, and you've got 20% of people answering I don't know straight away. So there's a real drive to use that question. Brilliant, thank you. So one of our other questions, there's been some questions on the chat as well, is how you've informed using data for things that maybe hasn't been mentioned so far in the presentation. So I know, Andrew, come to you. I know that you've set up a employee resource group, and so how does data inform them, and how do they help you with the data?
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's been really useful having that group of 700 people, and they've got a sort of a board committee that sort of heads it up, to use them as a resource to be able to talk to them about data, and importantly to talk to them about questions that we ask. And one of the reasons why we changed that question this year to put in the free school meals was quite a kind of appetite from staff to do that. So it's great to be able to have like a kind of a group of staff who are very much interested in this subject to go to directly, in the same way as if you were talking about disability, you go to the Disability Staff Network to talk to them directly about it. So they did quite a lot of consultation with their members about kind of what are the right questions that we should be asking, and they put forward some suggestions, some of which we were able to take forward, some of which we weren't. And they also helped us look at the parental occupation questions examples. So not those kind of overall buckets. We've obviously kind of kept those in line with the sort of Commission's advice, but some of the examples that we put, just to make sure that those are sort of as fit for purpose as possible, and also kind of make them really relevant for our industry as well, because I think when you're sort of looking down that list and there is where do you put camera technician, we were able to just get some advice from Bridge Group to be able to sort of slot those in there, and obviously once we start kind of looking at potentially setting a target, then we can talk to staff about that as well. So it's just really useful having that kind of two-way dialogue with staff about that sort of specific subject, rather than trying to be kind of quite scattergun talking to 22,000 staff about it. You can talk to a group of people that are already sort of engaged with the subject.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And having that sort of focus group to help you understand, are there any nuances in the questions you're asking that will be specific to your industry, I think is a brilliant idea to nuance that and see how that fits. Andrew, you mentioned that at the very beginning, you mentioned, and I loved the quote, it was that you wanted to separate the facts from fiction. And I think one of the questions that has come up from one of our people is they'd like to hear, is there anything, what's the most cutting edge example of using data, diversity data within an organisation have you heard on? So what's innovative out there, and what have you seen that is fantastic in terms of helping employees from low socio-economic backgrounds throughout their employee life cycle? So I think I'll come to you first, Cliff.
You caught me out. I was surprised there. I always worry when the words cutting edge and data are used in the same sentence. If I'm honest, I think I was thinking about this when I saw the example, and I think for me personally, I think whether you call it cutting edge or actually just impressive, I think one of the ways that we've used data in Hmrc over the last couple of years, and diversity inclusion data in particular, has been around race. And I mentioned before about our hopes to carry out a disparity audit around social mobility once we've got the data that allows us to do that. And the reason why that's quite exciting is we've seen how that's been used with race. So the disparity audit looked right across Hmrc from very start, from recruitment all the way through to joining and everything in between. And what it did was it focused very clearly on the different points that really affect people from a BAME background. And it was so telling. It was so powerful a tool, and that's now driving our race action plan. So that disparity audit for me really shows the value of good data. I don't know whether Abida's got anything to add.
Yeah, so for me, quantitative data has always been an eye-opener, and it's, for us in Hmrc, it's the first thing we ever do is try and put out there perhaps a survey with specific questions, not just the normal socio-economic background questions that Cabinet Office have, the usual free school meals and things, but the very, very first survey that we did was a social mobility survey, and that was in 2017. And we had our own internal personal questions that we thought we'd ask people just to get a bit of understanding. And what you get from the quantitative analysis and the outputs from surveys can really help you get some information and a baseline, basically, on what you need to look into a bit further. And that's when we then go into the qualitative aspect of focus groups or one-to-one interviews to get some richer insight into what we found, and it backs up the evidence as well of what we found as well. So I think quantitative data for us, and through surveys or any other sort of means, is one of the best ways that we can obtain the information that we are looking for about the profile of our workforce as such.
Brilliant, thanks, Abida. Andrew, anything you've seen innovative?
Yeah, BBC and Innovative. I think certainly the work that the Bridge Group did for us on that kind of in-depth data analysis, I think that was probably, I think it was something like 1.5 million data points which they analysed, which was the kind of career progression rates data, which is, I think you've got to be kind of pretty good with your maths to be able to kind of do that, because as I said, we published the sort of the raw data about how many people are where, but what they did was they looked back on a kind of historical basis way beyond when we were collecting this data. So when I joined the BBC sort of 12 years ago, obviously that data wasn't attached to my record, but they could look at kind of where I was today and my career journey, and see, based on my socio-economic diversity, how quickly I progressed, comparing it to somebody else. And for 22,000 staff, that was quite sort of yeah, I don't know how they did it, but it was something like 1.5 million data points. But it was just really useful to then start to see that kind of that that journey that people have. And you know, the further complexity for the BBC is that we don't have particularly linear career progression journeys either. We don't sort of start off on this grade and kind of move up in that same way necessarily. People sort of move around the organisation sideways and things. So it kind of made tracking it was quite difficult. But I think what that does mean is that then we're in a position to say, right, this is what people's kind of perceived experiences are. This is what people are telling us it's like. This is what they're saying they feel the barriers are. And then we can then, again, I guess, separate that fact from fiction, because then we could then show what the data tells us and see, well, this is how things are, and then put interventions in as a result of that. Brilliant.
Thanks, Andrew. And Heather, before we move on, do you have any?
Yeah, so I mean, I'd emphasise the points Andrew made about mapping progression pathways. That's exactly what we need individual organisations to be doing. I mean, the point I would add was actually how you can use data to have wider influence, actually, and incentivise wider groups of businesses to kind of really embrace this agenda. And it's something I'm interested in for the creative industries. So, you know, systems that embed monitoring within different industry contexts. So an example not currently applied to socio-economics, but generally looking at diversity is Project Diamond, which essentially measures diversity in all the major broadcasters. And that's quite interesting because that information is collected in distinct contexts within those production businesses. And that's quite challenging for an industry like the creative industries that relies on a freelance workforce. So it's not just simply about auditing who's on your, you know, who you directly employ, but who actually you're drawing on in terms of that freelancer talent. And then the other aspect would be around incentives. And this is something I think the BBC are leading on as well, which is around how you, if you're in a position where you fund or you finance or you look at your own supply chain, how you can start to incentivize either people you fund or people you kind of contract with to measure and equally target socioeconomics as part of that broader discussion around enhancing diversity and inclusion. And that's when it starts to get really exciting in terms of catalyzing industry leadership, you know, that collective action on some of these issues.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I mean, that sounds great in terms of how do you influence others, absolutely, to make that change that you're also going through yourself. So just before we move on, I was going to mention a couple that I've seen. So I've heard of organisations that are not only publishing pay gaps, but they're also publishing stay gaps, which I think is fantastic. So you're doing a lot of work to encourage people from all sorts of diverse backgrounds to come into your organisation, but when they get there, do they feel like they fit and do they feel like they belong? So are they staying in the organisation, or are they not feeling like that they belong and therefore leaving? So I think that's a really interesting one. And then just actually using diversity data to look at the sentiment of your employees through your engagement surveys that you do already. So, for instance, if you've got, you know, 78% of your employees say that our organisation cares about our well-being, and yet a certain population within that is a lot lower than that benchmark average, then you know, there's some work to be done there. So there's a real deep dive that you could do on it. So there's lots of stuff that you could be getting on with, I think, in terms of from an innovative basis. But I think the key thing is to just hashtag ask the question about main householders, main occupation of the in your household when you were 14, and then once you've got that again set against your employees, you can look at them through the lens of all sorts of data, from kind of getting in to getting on, and also to be rewarded as well. So I'd just like to thank our speakers for their time, and any questions that weren't asked, we might, you know, be able to put something out in some of the follow-up pack or future opportunities. But I'm going to move on now to something that you all collect data for, which is, if I can get my screen to move, is the Social Mobility Employers Index. I'm having a bit of a screen problem here, but I'd like to introduce Maureen from the Social Mobility Foundation. Bear with me if I can get my screen to move. God.
Great, thanks a lot, Paula.
It's not moving, there it is.
Great, thanks a lot, Paula. Thank you all for your really interesting contributions. It was great to see Hmrc and the BBC participating in this masterclass for both top 75 employers in the employer index. And I'm just a bit conscious of time, so I'm going to try to do this fast. I just want to speak with you about the index as a tool to benchmark and audit both your approach to data collection and the data that you collected. If you move on to the next slide, I can give you some background information on the. Sorry, I just muted myself. The index was established in 2017 to encourage firms to become more accessible to individuals from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, and it has become an authority in employer-led social mobility. It's the 5th year of the index running now, which is really exciting. We already had a lot of interest from employers who have submitted in the past to resubmit this year, and also a lot of new employers have shown their interest in submitting to the index. Last year, in 2020, 119 employers from about 17 different sectors submitted to the index. And you can see our top 75 from 2020, both with BBC and Hmrc featured. And the index really ranks UK employers on the efforts they make to improve social mobility, but it's an audit, not an award. So we help employers answer the question, do people enter and progress within your organization based on their ability and effort, or does their social background or their class affect how successful they are within your organization? And if your data show that social background plays a role, the index tells you what you can do about it, monitors your progress. So I'm just going to speak a bit about how the index will help you to step up your data collection on the next slide, on this slide. Thank you, Paula. So why should you take part in the employer index? First of all, it's a free of charge audit, and you can enter anonymously. Each organization receives an individual feedback report highlighting areas they performed well in, and also where improvements can be made. And we also compare how your organization performed compared to other index entrants in each section. And data really is at the heart of the index. And your feedback report will show you where your data collection is working well, but it will also address where there are gaps in the data collection and advise you on which next steps to take. And if you are just at the beginning of your data collection, the index will really help you to further formulate your approach to this. You also have the possibility to meet with the SNF team after your index to just discuss your feedback in more detail. And the feedback that we've received from many organizations is that they have found the index very useful in forming their social mobility strategy or monitoring the progress of their existing work. And like I said before, you can enter anonymously. We would only ever publish the top 75, but not disclose any ranking outside of the top 75. Further, 86% of last year's entrants said that their clients care about the socioeconomic background of their workforce. And the same applies for applicants and graduates. So social agenda is getting more and more important. And the index will help you to benchmark your data against other UK employers and also enable you to communicate to clients and applicants how diverse your workforce really is. And then, of course, through participating, you can be a trailblazer for social mobility. If you participate and show that you are collecting data on the SAB of the workforce, others will follow and raise awareness for social mobility across the UK, which I think is kind of a common goal of the group that is on this webinar today. And then you're also going to get advice based on your data on if you reach applicants from lower SAB backgrounds, and if these make it through your application process, or if there is kind of an untapped pool of talent somewhere that you're not reaching through your current selection and recruitment processes. On the next slide, I've just quickly going to explain how submitting to the index works. So the submissions are open now, and the closing date for submissions will be in late May. And all entrants are asked to complete an online survey, asking for information and data across 7 different areas covered in the index, which I'm going to show you on the next slide. And then over the summer, we at the SNF mark the responses and benchmark your submission. And in September or October, you will receive your tailored feedback report detailing how you performed in each of these sections. And we're also going to offer you a meeting to discuss your findings. And then later on in autumn, we announce the top 75 and the key findings report. And along this entire process, the SNF is there to provide personal support and to guide you through the application or submission process. So there's help available along the way, and we can have one-to-one discussion before your submission. We have published guidelines, there will be a webinar, a forum with tips and advice, and our team is also available for any ad hoc questions. On the next slide is just a brief overview of what we look at in the index. So there are roughly 100 questions across 7 sections or key areas that drive social mobility in employer practice. And these 7 sections cover the entire employee cycle. And you're going to see that data collection is at the heart of many of those sections. So as we will analyze your data in all of these sections and then draw conclusions on how inclusive your organization is and how your data compares to the data of other organizations that submitted to the index. So submitting will give you a good idea in which areas you're doing well and in which areas you should focus on in your approach to social mobility. For example, we might be looking at the SAB data of the students you reach in your outreach, and this data might show that you reach and target the right group of students. But then looking at your SAB data of your new hires could show that students from lower income backgrounds fall down at certain stages in the recruitment process. And the index will help you to look at why this might be and also suggest steps to remove barriers for those students so they can progress in the recruitment process. And this is just a list of the different kind of 7 different sections in the index. So you can see it goes from outreach to routes into the employer, where we look at your internships and apprenticeships if you offer any. In attraction, we look a lot about which universities you target if you have a graduate scheme. And then there's one section focused on data collection, where we ask you what data points you collect and also compare your completion rate with the completion rates of other organizations. And then we also look at experienced hire, just to see if you collect data on the background, on the pay, the progression, etc. of someone in relation to their socio-economic background. And there is also an employee survey, which is optional, but it's a really great tool for you to ask your employees certain questions via us, and you would then get an analysis of what your employees have said. And it's a great tool for you to see how your staff or your colleagues perceive the culture in regards to social mobility within your workplace. We do understand that not all organizations will score marks for each section. For example, if you don't have a formal graduate scheme based on your size, and therefore organizations are ranked based on the percentage of available marks they have achieved. And then, just on the last slide, it'd be amazing to see some of you joining the index this year, or to have spread the word to your suppliers and your clients. And to register to the index, just visit our website, which you can see on the slide. And there you will find a link to the survey, which will also give you access to the guidance notes and the questions of the survey. And if you have any follow-up questions or are interested in submitting, but you're not sure if it's the right thing for you to do this year, just send me an email on employerindex@socialmobility.org.uk. Thanks a lot.
Brilliant. Thanks, Maureen. And having worked for an organisation where we did actually submit to the Social Mobility Employer Index, I can say that we started without having very much to go on at the beginning, in terms of we weren't collecting all of the data. It gave us a really good indication of what we needed to start doing, just to move slightly, with no full expectations necessarily to be in the top 75, but where do we start? And it gave us a really good framework. So I would say, even if you're not very far along your journey, it may be a good opportunity for you to build a framework around what you're doing. So thank you very much for that. So we've come to the end. We've got a few dates for the diary. So the Social Mobility Awards are also open for entries. So you'll see that on the screen, and also in the after pack, we'll send you the link. Both the BBC and Hmrc have been commended in the past, and or have won awards in the past for that. So it's you're being good company if you enter into that. And then our next masterclass is on progression, and this is key for us in terms of that week, because we'll actually be producing a report, Social Mobility Commission report, research report into progression within the civil service, and that's a major piece of work for us. So we'll be really pleased to be able to tell you a bit more about it on that. And on that session, we'll be joined by the Cabinet Office and also KPMG, who will be talking a bit more in depth in terms of how they approach progression with regards to social mobility. So just remains for me to thank our speakers. So Andrew, Cliff, Heather, Maureen and Abeda, and thank you all for joining as well, and thank you all for your questions. Sorry we didn't get to all of them, but we ran out of time. So and look forward to seeing you on a future masterclass. Thank you.
Everyone, thank you.
Bye. Bye.